In a world where death walked the earth, refusing to stay buried, humanity learned to survive and to break. That was the story of Rick Grimes' group, of hardened survivors who had clawed their way through endless horrors, holding tight to a fragile flicker of humanity. But even the strongest could falter, and fate had ways of testing a man's soul. That was how Daryl Dixon found himself kneeling in the cold gray dirt of the hilltop courtyard, bloodied, caked in mud, and staring at a grinning monster holding a bat wrapped in barbed wire. Negan's voice echoed in the silence of the gathered crowd, a hoarse chuckle slicing through the tension like a blade. "So here's the thing, Daryl. You're strong. You're loyal, damned good with a crossbow, and you're angry, like the kind of angry that fills a man up like a balloon about to pop. I see it in you, man. You're made for this world, made for my crew. So I gotta wonder, why the hell are you wasting your time with these people?" He gestured at Rick, Maggie, and the others, all frozen in a standoff too fragile to fracture. There was a flicker of defiance in Daryl's eyes, his lips pressing into a thin, bloodied line. But the weight of the past weeks, the death of Glenn, the weight of guilt pressing harder than Negan's boots ever had, crushed him down. His silence had cost lives, yet his words had failed to save anyone. And now, kneeling in the dirt under the blistering heat of Negan's twisted generosity, he wondered if this was a choice or a trap. "I ain't like you," Daryl growled finally, but his voice wavered. Negan laughed. "Oh, you're exactly like me. You just haven't let go of that tight little noose you call a conscience. That's your problem, Daryl. You're holding on. But hey, lucky for you." He crouched until his face was inches from Daryl's, Lucille resting lightly on his shoulder like a specter of death. "I'm pretty damn good at snipping loose threads." The others were shouting protests, but Negan raised a hand and silenced them with a smile. "It's simple. You come with me, and we all walk out of here happy as clams. You don't, well, let's say Hilltop's gonna need a new cobbler, 'cause their leader's feet'll be dangling from the nearest tree." Daryl's gaze flicked to Maggie, her swollen belly a silent reminder of what was at stake. To Rick, trembling with rage but holding himself in check for the sake of his people. To the others who depended on him to make the right decision, though none of them would ever say those words aloud. And, for a flicker of a moment, he wondered if maybe Negan was right. That Rick's way, endless fighting, endless death, always seemed to bring ruin. Maybe this was survival. Maybe this was the price. Without another word, he rose to his feet. The change rippled through the group like a shockwave. Maggie shouted, "No, Daryl, don't." But Rick's voice broke through it all, low and shattered. "Daryl, don't do this." The archer didn't look back. His shoulders remained hunched but steady as he stepped past Rick, avoiding his gaze. He felt the weight of his brother's disappointment like a knife in the back. He heard Michonne curse under her breath, felt Carol's anguish even without needing to see her face. But he couldn't stop. Not now. Not after everything. Negan beamed as he clapped his hands together. "See, now that's a man who knows how to make a tough decision. Trust me, people, he'll be in good hands. Better than yours, that's for damn sure." Daryl stared down at the dusty ground, his hand twitching involuntarily. Somewhere deep inside, he felt something break and snap, like a string pulled too tight. And so, just like that, Daryl Dixon joined the Saviors. Life among the Saviors was nothing like the prison or Alexandria. It was ruthless, cold, and unapologetically survivalist. But as much as he hated it, Daryl couldn't deny that they were effective. Order was enforced by fear, but it worked. The soldiers ate, the lieutenants thrived, the workers toiled, bowed, scraped, and survived another day in Negan's kingdom. He spent weeks under Dwight's shadow, learning the rhythms of his new place. The crossbow, a weapon stolen from him long ago, was returned, a twisted gesture of goodwill from Negan himself. "See? I told you I take care of my people," Negan had said. Only now, his people came with numbers burned onto their skin and blood on their hands. It was survival. It was nothing more than that. At least, that's what Daryl told himself every night lying on the hard cot, staring at the peeling corrugated walls of his small quarters in the sanctuary. But the guilt was louder than the excuses. At night, he saw their faces. Glenn, Abraham, the people they'd lost protecting Hilltop. And most of all, Rick's voice haunted him. Low and distant, like a ghost. Don't do this. His allegiance wasn't born of love for Negan, it never could be. But he worked. He wore the leather jacket. He stood among the lieutenants as Negan's finest. And quietly, he built himself back up from the man who had knelt, bruised and broken, in Hilltop's dirt that day. It wasn't until Negan's patience turned violent against Alexandria that Daryl realized how little of himself was left. Assigned to oversee an example after Alexandria failed to meet quota, Daryl followed orders with a silent rage burning inside him. He smashed fences, broke down doors, stole crops. Yet every swing of his arm felt heavier than the last. He couldn't bear to look at Rick or Michonne. Their deaths locked under Negan's decree if they resisted. But when they found Judith crying in the burnt hull of her house, terrorized but unharmed, Daryl cracked. His hands stilled mid-loot, frozen by the piercing sound of her sobs. He wasn't prepared for that moment, for the innocence and humanity of it. Daryl? Rick limped forward, blood dripping from a fresh wound. You know this ain't you. It wasn't. And yet, he couldn't respond, couldn't let the wall he'd built for weeks crash down in that instant. Instead, Negan's voice cut through it all, loud and cheerful and drenched in malice. Don't go soft on me now, Dixon. Go on. Show them who works for who. Daryl hesitated. His hand drifted toward the knife on his belt. Judith's crying didn't stop. It didn't stop. And before anyone could react, Daryl's arm shot out. Not toward Alexandria, not toward its ruined fences or Rick's group, toward Negan. Lucille struck the floor before the barbed wire could become another reminder of death. In one sudden motion, Daryl placed the knife tight against the neck of the man who had haunted his nightmares for months. The gathered crowd gasped. Negan's grin didn't falter. Well now, looks like someone's got cold feet. Rick didn't speak. He didn't move. If there was anything left between them, trust, anger, even desperation, it had melted into numbness long ago. But it was Judith's voice that broke through everything. Tiny and terrified, yet unyielding. Uncle Daryl? Something inside him shattered. The weight of the past months, the guilt, the shame. It all rushed forward as Daryl made his choice. With a flick of his wrist, he severed the fragile illusion of loyalty he'd held since Hilltop. Negan fell to the dirt, cursing through a gash on his neck that wasn't quite life-ending. But only because Daryl hadn't wanted it to be. Chaos erupted. The Saviors opened fire, scattering the survivors of Alexandria. But Rick's voice rose over the gunshots, rallying the group into action. Somewhere in the chaos, Daryl found himself standing shoulder to shoulder with his family again. Bloodied, battered, but fighting. He had betrayed them before, but now, with Alexandria burning around them, he would face the flames alongside them. By the time the fires died, the sanctuary itself had fallen into disarray. Negan's lieutenants fractured, divided over leadership in the wake of his downfall. Daryl had buried what remained of the sanctuary in ashes when he and Rick's group struck back. But redemption wasn't a clean road. It never could be, not in their world. Months later, Daryl knelt again, but this time it wasn't in dirt. He crouched over Judith, brushing a strand of hair from her soot-streaked face as she played outside of the newly rebuilt Alexandria walls. "Uncle Daryl?" she asked, looking up at him with the innocence that had saved his soul. "Are the bad men gone?" For a moment he couldn't answer. The truth was complicated. Survival was messy, and no matter how many walkers or tyrants they faced, humanity had proven time and again that the real danger lay within. "They're gone for now, kid," Daryl finally said, and then he managed a small, rare smile. "But we don't stop fighting, all right? Not ever." She nodded and ran off, chasing butterflies as if the world wasn't broken into pieces, as if she didn't know better. Rick's voice interrupted the quiet. "She forgave you a long time ago, you know?" Daryl rose slowly, His eyes flicked to Rick's face, weathered with years of losses but still strong, still standing. Doesn't mean I'll forgive myself. Rick nodded, brooding in silence for a heartbeat too long before saying, "We need you, Daryl. Always did." And for once, Daryl believed it. The days stretched into weeks after the fall of the sanctuary. Daryl found himself caught in the dissonance between action and aftermath. He had never been the talking type, and there were things that couldn't be fixed with words anyway. Damage lingered, like a splinter working its way deeper under his skin, but Alexandria stood again. And for the first time in a long time, Daryl had begun to hope that maybe, just maybe, they could carve out a life beyond the ruins and rage. Rick's group had welcomed him back, but their trust didn't come as easily. There were moments when Maggie's gaze lingered on him for too long, her grief for Glenn pounding like a heartbeat between them. There were moments when Rosita would turn sharply at his voice, her expression like flint, as if expecting the worst. The only ones who didn't look at him differently were Rick and Judith, and that was the hardest part of all. Forgiveness, he realized, could sometimes feel heavier than disdain. Every morning, Daryl rose with the sun, avoiding the encampments of others at Alexandria's revived heart. He kept busy at the outer perimeter instead, patrolling the expanding boundary lines, fixing weak points in the fence, killing walkers before they got too close. It was easier to keep his distance. The work was straightforward, and walkers didn't ask questions about where his loyalties lay. He didn't need them to. He barely trusted himself half the time. One morning, as the mist was burning off the land, he came across Carol working on a makeshift barricade near the outer wall. Her hair gleamed silver in the early light, her eyes tired but sharp as ever. They hadn't talked much since that day, and her silence had carved its own wound in him. A quiet grief he couldn't bring himself to confront. "You gonna stand there all day?" she asked, without looking up. "Or are you gonna help me?" Taking the unspoken olive branch, Daryl knelt by her side and began lashing wood together with lengths of salvaged rope. The blunt sound of effort filled the gap between them for a while. Grunts, the scrape of bark, the soft groan of shifting timber. It wasn't until the barricade was half finished that she finally spoke again. "You weren't wrong, you know, about Negan's way keeping people alive." Daryl's hands halted, mud-streaked and calloused, as he tried to gauge her tone. It wasn't anger. It wasn't approval. Just the flat, unsentimental truth. "But survival's not the same as living," Carol continued, tightening one of the knots with a yank. "You gotta remember that. You can't forget it. Not again." "I won't," Daryl muttered. Came out rougher than he intended, like gravel spilling between his teeth. But he meant it. God, he meant it. Carol simply nodded and returned to her work, and it was enough. It didn't heal the past, but it planted a seed for something better. The weeks bled on. Daryl busied himself with tasks around Alexandria, avoiding direct confrontations but pulling his weight where it mattered. Sometimes he would catch glimpses of Maggie sparring with Jesus in the training yard. Other times, he would see Rick poring over maps with Michonne, planning the next moves to fortify their remaining allies. The Kingdom, Oceanside, even what was left of Hilltop after Negan's raid. They had futures to build, relationships to mend. Daryl worked beneath it all like a shadow, silent and unyielding. But he knew something was festering, something dark growing beneath the surface. It came in whispered conversations outside his earshot, in the way people flinched when new travelers arrived at the gates, in the subtle but constant tightening of the defenses. He could feel the bitterness, the edges of it spreading like wildfire from those left most scarred by Negan's rule. That bitterness found its voice not in Maggie, as Daryl might have expected, but in a young man named Colin. Colin had arrived months ago, ragged and hungry after wandering through the ruins of what used to be Virginia. Daryl didn't know his story, nor did he care to ask, but the kid had a spark of anger in him that reminded Daryl of an earlier version of himself, back before the world had worn him down into something harder, less forgiving. "It's not enough," Colin hissed one night as Daryl patrolled the perimeter. The boy had been hunkered near the fence, sharpening a blade that looked like it had been fashioned from a piece of scrap metal. "What ain't enough?" Daryl grunted, not breaking stride. Letting them get away with it? Colin snapped, fixing him with a glare so heated it might have burned through steel. What they did. Alexandria, Hilltop, Glen, Abraham. You don't just, move on from that. Daryl couldn't argue. He didn't want to. He understood vengeance too well, what it cost, what it demanded. Turning to the boy, he adjusted the crossbow on his shoulder and sighed. You think we didn't pay enough for it already? Was all he asked. Colin didn't answer at first. Instead, he stood, his wiry frame taut with barely checked anger. All I know is Negan's still out there, somewhere, and so are the rest of them, the ones still wearing their stupid vests, still thinking it's their world. Somebody oughta remind them it's not. Daryl tightened his grip on his crossbow. He didn't say it out loud, but the kid had a point. Negan's exile, deliberate and restrained on Rick's part, was a splinter beneath their skin, a risk they couldn't quite reckon with. But even so, Daryl knew where that road led. You want to stir that up? Go ahead, he drawled. But you don't get to talk about fightin' for the dead if it leaves more of us buried alongside him. Colin sneered but said nothing further, retreating into the darkness. Daryl sighed again, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. The confrontation rattled around Daryl's head for days. It gnawed and itched, pulling pieces of his focus away from his duties. The truth was, Negan's absence didn't feel like closure. It felt like waiting. Rick said time would erode Negan's following, that surviving itself would break the saviors like waves past their high-water mark. Maybe Rick was right. Maybe. Or maybe Negan wasn't done yet. The next time Daryl crossed paths with Rick, he told him as much. It was late, and Rick was standing near the gate, leaning against his rifle as the night pressed heavy on the distant woods. He didn't look at Daryl immediately when he approached. We did right by not killing him back then, Rick muttered almost to himself. Didn't feel like it at the time. Still don't most days. But if we'd killed him just to make ourselves feel better. He trailed off and shook his head, his voice heavy with exhaustion. We'd be something less than what we are now. Daryl understood the rationale, but it burned his throat all the same. And what are we now, huh? 'Cause we sure as hell ain't safe. No, we're not, Rick admitted. Never will be. The two men fell into a grim silence, their only company the restless trees swaying beyond the walls. After a while, Rick smiled. A tired, crooked thing that didn't quite reach his eyes. Still, he said softly, I'm glad you're back where you belong. Daryl said nothing. He didn't need to. For once, the silence between them wasn't heavy, but a balm, a moment to breathe. It didn't last. A week later, raiders struck the kingdom while Ezekiel was away on a supply run. The ensuing brutality sent shockwaves through the alliance. Their people scattered, resources stolen, their trust fractured at the seams. By the time Ezekiel returned to the wreckage, what was left of his home felt like it was crumbling out from under him. The guilty party wasn't hard to find. They were saviors, or what was left of them. Splinter groups still carving their place in a world stripped of Negan's enforced order. They hadn't acted with his cunning or calculation, but their savagery carried echoes of his reign in every bloody step. Worse, Negan's name was whispered among them like a banner still held high. When word of the attack reached Alexandria, there was no debate over what needed to be done. Too much had been lost to let it slide. They would strike back, not just to secure the alliance, but to send a message to anyone else who still believed they could claw power from fear. Daryl packed his crossbow without hesitation. He didn't look back. The alliance's retaliation came swiftly. Guided by desperation and hardened resolve, they moved like shadows through the remnants of the ruined world. Daryl rode at the vanguard, his crossbow strapped tightly to his back, silent as ever but exuding a quiet rage that could be felt by everyone around him. Words had long since become a luxury, their world prizing action above all else. Rick led the convoy, his face etched with determination. Beside him, Michonne clutched her katana, her knuckles white around the worn hilt, her expression unreadable. The rest of the group followed. Jesus, light-footed with his uncanny grace. Rosita, her rifle slung across her back, her eyes sharp and vengeful. And Aaron, quieter now since losing Eric, but no less resolved. Behind them rode more of the Alliance. Hilltop fighters, kingdom survivors, Alexandrians. An army of the wounded and weary, bound together by an unspoken promise. No more losses. The trail led them deep into the forests surrounding the ruins of the kingdom. Daryl moved ahead, scouting the terrain, his senses sharp as a blade. The scent of rot mingled with pine, and the faint, acrid tang of smoke lingered on the breeze. They were close. He could feel it. When he spotted the raiders' camp, it wasn't what he expected. It wasn't some triumphant, fortified stronghold or even a half-decent outpost. Instead, it was desperate. A ragtag assembly of tents and tarps, hastily thrown together around the carcass of a burnt-out gas station. Their firelight flickered weakly against the growing dusk, their sentries idle and sloppy at their posts. But what chilled Daryl most wasn't the state of their camp. It was the faces of the saviors, or what was left of them. These weren't men and women who had thrived under Negan's rule. These were the strays, the remnants clinging to the memory of their former leader like rats clinging to a sinking ship. And yet, their desperation made them dangerous. He'd seen it before. People with nothing left to lose had a way of dragging others down to their level. Daryl slithered back to the main group, crouched low in the underbrush. Rick met his eyes, and the two communicated without words, a habit long since ingrained in their partnership. Daryl gave a slight nod. They would take the camp tonight, striking swiftly in, leaving no room for hesitation. The plan unfolded as it always did in their world. In brutal silence, with no guarantees of survival. The first sentry, a scrawny teen clutching a rusted machete, didn't even see the knife coming until it was too late. Jesus moved silently, dispatching another guard with sickening precision. They worked quickly, efficiently, spreading like ghosts through the camp. When the shouting began, it wasn't theirs. A gunshot split the night, and chaos erupted. Fires overturned, tents collapsed, and the forest filled with the frenzied screams of ambushed survivors. Daryl moved through it all like a phantom, his crossbow finding its mark again and again. He didn't think, he acted. If he let himself think, he'd drown in the echoes of old guilt. By the time the dust settled, the camp was little more than smoldering ash. The last few saviors had thrown down their weapons, their faces streaked with smoke and fear, their hands held high in surrender. Rick and the rest of the group gathered around the survivors, panting and bloodied but triumphant. The firelight bathed Rick's face in an eerie glow as he stepped forward, his revolver still gleaming in his hand. Daryl stayed a step behind him, his presence a silent reminder of the consequences of dissent. "You took from us," Rick began. His voice wasn't a shout, nor a whisper. It carried the weight of something larger, something final. "You took from the kingdom. You thought being desperate was an excuse. It's not." One of the survivors, a man older than Daryl would have pegged for a raider, took a trembling step forward. His grizzled beard was streaked with ash, his eyes hollow. When he spoke, it was with the broken rasp of someone who'd been fighting too long. He coughed, doubling over briefly. "We ain't got Negan anymore. You know that. We ain't got nobody. Just scraps. Just survival." Rick's revolver twitched slightly in his hand. "You think that's enough reason to tear down what's left of other people's lives?" "Ain't no lives left to tear down," the man spat. "Not real ones." Rick hesitated, the words cutting deeper than any knife. Daryl watched his leader closely, trying to gauge whether mercy or rage would win out. Could go either way. It always could. But before Rick could make his decision, it was Michonne who stepped forward. Her voice, sharp and unwavering, cut through the tension like a blade. "There's a way to live without taking from others. You don't want to learn it? Fine. But this is the last time you will." The ultimatum hung in the air. Daryl felt a flicker of recognition behind some of the saviors' gaunt faces, a silent understanding that they were being offered something they didn't deserve, a second chance. Others only had resentment in their eyes, seething and waiting for a moment to lash out. Rick slowly lowered his gun. Though his body stayed tense, ready to react at the first sign of betrayal. "Leave," he said, his voice as cold as the ash falling around them. "Walk away, and don't come back." The defeated saviors hesitated. Daryl could see the doubt in their movements, the reluctance in their shuffling steps. But one by one, they turned and slinked into the forest, their figures swallowed by the shadows. As the quiet returned, Rick turned to the others. "Clear the rest of the camp. Take what we can use. Burn the rest." Daryl moved wordlessly to follow the order, but his mind stayed tethered to the interaction. Rick's mercy, while effective, didn't feel like closure. Those saviors, they didn't disappear. They'd scatter, regroup, come back in some other guise with new leaders and the same old hunger. Daryl had seen it too many times before. The group returned to Alexandria the next day, carts laden with scavenged supplies. Exhaustion weighed heavy on them, but they moved with an efficiency born of necessity. Daryl avoided eye contact with everyone as they passed through the gates, lost in his own thoughts. The people inside cheered their return, relief etched on faces that had seen too much fear. But Daryl didn't linger to bask in their gratitude. He slipped away, seeking the solace of the outer edge of the community. As he leaned against the battered wall, staring out at the horizon, he heard footsteps approach. He knew it was Rick before the voice came. "Something's eating at you," Rick said quietly, stepping up beside him. Daryl didn't answer right away. He watched the trilene sway in the distance, the endless cycle of survival spinning in his mind. "Ain't the end of it," he finally muttered. "You know that." Rick sighed, his hand brushing the wound on his side, an old injury that still hadn't fully healed. He didn't ask for clarification. He didn't need to. It never is. Daryl glanced sidelong at his leader. Rick's face was worn, not just by age but by the weight of endless decisions, each one chipping a little more away from the man he used to be. Daryl wondered if his old friend even recognized himself anymore. He wasn't sure he did. "What are we even fighting for, Rick?" Daryl's voice was low, gruff, and raw. "'Cause it feels like every time we get one step ahead, there's something else dragging us back. Like we're stuck in a circle we can't ever crawl out of." Rick took a long moment before replying. He turned his eyes toward the distant horizon, the same horizon Daryl had been staring at, as if trying to see what lay beyond it. When he spoke, his voice was tired, but firm. "We're fighting for the people who can't fight anymore. For Judith. For Maggie's baby. For all the ones who didn't make it." His grip tightened on the rail. "We ain't stuck in a circle, Daryl. We're building something. It's just gonna take time." Rick walked away after that, leaving Daryl alone with his thoughts once more. But his words lingered, rooting themselves somewhere deep in Daryl's mind. Maybe they were building something. Maybe they weren't. But no matter what, they couldn't stop moving forward. Not ever. That night, as the stars burned quietly overhead, Daryl sat by the fire outside his quarters, sharpening his knife. He thought of Colin's rage, of Judith's innocence, of the man he used to be and the man he might still become. And he resolved, for better or worse, to keep moving forward, even if the path ahead was worn and broken.